Victor Clarkson's world is thrown into turmoil when he spots Emily Parker at the bank, wearing a necklace strikingly similar to the one his daughter wore before she disappeared 20 years ago. What starts as a simple question quickly unfolds into a search for hidden truths and the hope of a reunion he never thought possible. If this story captured your interest, please like and subscribe to help us bring you more gripping tales. Now let's begin this journey together. Victor Clarkson stood in front of the tall, imposing glass doors of the Heritage National Bank, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on him. It had been years since he had set foot in a bank personally. He had long since entrusted his business dealings to a team of representatives. But today was different. Today, he had come to close a deal, a final transaction that would allow him to step away from the company he had built to retreat into the quiet life that had always eluded him. He adjusted the sleeves of his tailored suit, his fingers brushing against the fine silk cufflinks that had once felt like a symbol of his success, now a reminder of the emptiness that had come to define his life. He had everything a man could want: wealth, power, influence. But there was one thing he could never buy back: his daughter, Lily. 20 years ago, she had vanished without a trace, just 5 years old. Her disappearance had shattered everything: his marriage, his peace of mind, his very soul. Every waking moment since had been consumed by the search for her. But no matter how many detectives he hired, no matter how much money he threw at the case, there had been no answers, no sign, no closure. Victor stepped inside the bank, the cool air conditioning greeting him like an old friend. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the soft hum of conversation from the employees filled the air. It all felt so normal, so predictable. Everything he had longed for in the chaos of the years following Lily's disappearance. He made his way to the counter, where a young woman, no older than 25, stood behind a stack of paperwork. Her nameplate read, Emily Parker. And she looked up from her desk as he approached, her face lighting up with a friendly smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I assist you today?" Her voice was soft, but there was an undeniable warmth in it. Victor had always been known for his composed demeanor, his ability to maintain control in even the most stressful situations. But today something was different. Something about this woman, this young clerk, struck a nerve in him. As he looked at her, he felt an unsettling familiarity, as though something deep within his memory was stirring, begging to be remembered. He stared at her a little longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her features. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform impeccable, but it was something around her neck that caught his attention. A pendant, simple, delicate, but unmistakable, the very same design that had adorned his daughter's neck the day she vanished. Victor's breath hitched, his heart racing in his chest. The pendant was identical to the one Lily had worn, the one she had refused to take off, even as she got older. It was a small gold locket, shaped like a heart, engraved with intricate patterns on its surface. He had bought it for her as a gift when she was just 4, a symbol of his love and protection. His hand instinctively reached into his coat pocket, his fingers grazing the same locket that had been locked away in the back of his drawer for years. The very thought of it, of Lily, of the night she disappeared, caused a tightness in his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that pendant?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but the words came out more forcefully than he intended. Emily looked up at him, momentarily taken aback by the intensity in his gaze. Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, placing her hands neatly on the desk as she answered. "Oh, this? It was a gift from my grandmother. She gave it to me on my birthday last year." Victor's mind whirled. He had to be imagining things. It couldn't be. But the pendant, the resemblance was too striking to ignore. His mind raced back to that fateful day. Lily, wearing that very necklace, smiling up at him as they played in the garden. He had kissed her forehead, telling her he would always protect her. That was the last time he had seen her. The memory cut deep, the wound as fresh as if it had happened only yesterday. "I see," Victor murmured, his voice colder now, as his thoughts turned darker. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease settling in his chest. "You say your grandmother gave it to you. Do you mind if I ask where she got it?" Emily hesitated for a moment, and then, sensing no malice in his tone, she answered. She said it had been passed down through our family for generations. It's an old heirloom, I guess. Victor nodded slowly, his mind grappling with the information. He knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this was no coincidence. The pendant was not some random family heirloom. It was his daughter's. The connection was undeniable, and yet the questions only multiplied. How could this young woman have it? Could she be related to his daughter in some way? Was this all some cruel twist of fate? He stared at Emily, his gaze intense. The weight of the years, the grief, the unanswered questions, all of it was flooding back in that moment. I apologize, he said, forcing a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. It's just this pendant. It's very similar to one my daughter used to wear. Emily blinked, clearly confused. Your daughter? Yes, Victor said, his voice shaking slightly. My daughter, Lily. She disappeared a long time ago. Oh, Emily's face softened with sympathy. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. No, Victor interrupted, shaking his head, his mind already spinning with possibilities. It's fine. His voice trailed off as his mind continued to race. There was something about this moment, about this woman, that felt like a sign. A clue, perhaps. A thread that he had to pull, no matter how painful it might be. He took a step back from the counter, his heart pounding in his chest. I'll take care of the transaction later, he said, his voice distant now, as though he were speaking from another world. Thank you. Emily nodded, looking puzzled, but before she could say anything more, Victor turned and walked out of the bank. His thoughts were a blur, but there was no mistaking what he had to do next. He had to find out more about Emily Parker. There were too many coincidences, too many questions. He had to know if this young woman was somehow connected to his daughter, if she held the key to a mystery that had haunted him for 20 long years. The search for Lily was not over. It had just begun again. Victor Clarkson's estate loomed ahead as he drove through the large wrought iron gates. The mansion was as magnificent as it had been the day he had purchased it, but to him it now felt like a hollow monument to years of emptiness. The sprawling lawns and meticulously manicured gardens were all designed to convey the perfect life. But inside, behind the grand walls, there was only silence. The house had once been filled with laughter, with the joyful chaos of a young family. But that had been before Lily disappeared. Victor parked the car in the driveway and sat for a long moment, his fingers gripping the steering wheel, his mind lost in thought. His gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, where the reflection of the house seemed to mock him. It was all so surreal, this life that had become his. For years, he had been consumed by the search for Lily. Every waking moment, every breath had been devoted to finding his daughter. Yet now, after 2 decades of dead ends, the haunting vision of Emily at the bank, the girl with the pendant, had reignited a hope he had buried long ago. He stepped out of the car, the weight of the years heavy on his shoulders, and made his way to the front door. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. No one was waiting for him. No sounds of children's laughter or the faint hum of a television. Just the echo of his footsteps on the marble floors. The emptiness had become his constant companion, his only family. Victor moved through the house like a man on autopilot, his steps mechanical, until he reached the library. The room where he'd spent countless hours poring over every lead, every photograph, every scrap of information in his relentless search for Lily. He reached the desk and stood still for a moment, his eyes falling on the last photo of his daughter. It was an old photograph, taken when she was just 4 years old. She was smiling brightly, wearing the pendant, the same heart-shaped locket that Emily had been wearing. Victor's breath caught in his throat as he picked up the picture, his fingers brushing over the image of his daughter's face. The photograph was worn at the edges, yellowed with age, but Lily's face was as vivid in his memory as if she were standing right in front of him. The pendant glinted in the photograph, its gold surface catching the light of the camera flash, just as it had caught Victor's attention in the bank. His heart tightened in his chest. How could Emily, this young woman, be wearing the same pendant? The one that had been his gift to Lily, the one she had worn every day for as long as he could remember? He placed the photograph back on the desk and sat in the leather chair, the weight of the years pressing down on him. He thought of everything he had lost. The years of searching, the endless phone calls to private investigators, the countless hours spent in the wake of his daughter's disappearance, trying to piece together fragments of a mystery that had never been solved. His marriage to Caroline had crumbled under the strain of it all. She had tried to hold on, to stay hopeful, but the grief was too much. It consumed them both, and when Caroline could no longer bear the uncertainty, she left. Victor had been left alone in the house, his mind consumed by thoughts of Lily, of where she could be, what had happened to her. His only solace had been the search, a search that, despite all his wealth and connections, had brought him nothing but dead ends. But now, the sight of Emily and the pendant had reignited something in Victor. A flicker of hope, buried beneath years of despair, stirred deep within him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the locket, the very one Lily had worn. It was cold to the touch, the metal smooth beneath his fingers. He had kept it locked away for years, unable to bring himself to part with it. It was the only tangible connection to his daughter, the only thing left of the little girl who had once filled his life with joy. As he held the locket in his hand, memories flooded back, memories of Lily's laughter, her tiny hands reaching up to him for comfort, her sparkling eyes filled with curiosity. He could still remember the day he had bought the locket for her. It had been a special occasion, her 4th birthday. He had spent hours choosing the perfect gift, something that would symbolize his love for her, something that would be with her always. He had wanted her to know that no matter what happened, he would always protect her, always be there for her. But now, after all these years, he had to face the painful truth. He had failed her. He had promised to keep her safe, but he had been powerless to protect her from whatever had happened that night. The night she vanished. Victor closed his eyes, trying to shut out the images of that dark night, the one that had turned his world upside down. He remembered the phone call, the frantic voice of the police officer on the other end, telling him that Lily was gone. He remembered the gut-wrenching feeling that had settled in his stomach when he heard those words. Gone. His little girl, the love of his life, just gone. And now, here he was, sitting in his library, holding the pendant in his hands, wondering if Emily might somehow be connected to his lost daughter. Could it be? Was this young woman somehow linked to Lily's disappearance? The questions piled up, one after another, faster than he could process them. Victor stood up abruptly, the locket still clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't let this go. He had to know. He had to find the answers, no matter where they led. He couldn't afford to ignore the possibility, not when it felt like fate had dropped this clue into his lap. Emily Parker, was she just a stranger, or was she the key to unraveling the mystery of Lily's disappearance? With a sudden sense of urgency, Victor strode toward the door, determined to find out everything he could about Emily. He had no idea where this new lead would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. His search for Lily was far from over. It had just taken on a new, more personal dimension. The past, with all its pain and unanswered questions, was still very much alive in him. But now, perhaps, there was a way to bridge the gap between the past and the future. Maybe, just maybe, Emily could help him uncover the truth and finally bring his daughter home. Victor sat at his desk, staring at the locket in his hand, the cold metal biting into his palm. The hours had blurred into one another since he'd left the bank, and a familiar sense of urgency had begun to gnaw at him. There was no time to waste, no time for second thoughts. For 20 years, he had lived with the ache of unanswered questions, of a daughter lost without a trace. Now, after all this time, he had something that felt like it could be the clue he had been waiting for. Emily, the young clerk with the pendant that matched Lily's. Victor ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He couldn't ignore this. It was too significant, too eerily coincidental. He had to know more about Emily Parker, who she was, where she came from, and what the connection to Lily might be. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone he could trust, someone who knew how to dig deep and find answers in places others overlooked. His mind immediately went to Samuel Reed. Samuel had been the private investigator Victor hired the day Lily disappeared. For years, Samuel had been his only ally in the search. He had worked tirelessly, chasing down every lead, running down every possible lead, no matter how far-fetched it seemed. Samuel had been a father himself, and he understood the pain of losing a child. Over the years, as the search became more and more desperate, Victor had grown to rely on him, not just as a professional, but as a friend. Samuel was older now, but Victor knew his skills hadn't dulled. He had kept tabs on Samuel through the years, and though the investigator had retired from full-time work, he still did occasional jobs. The phone rang twice before Samuel's familiar voice answered, thick with the weight of years, but warm and steady as always. "Victor, it's been a long time. How are you holding up?" Samuel's voice was gruff but kind, a reflection of the years spent in this line of work. "I'm not sure how I'm holding up," Victor replied, his voice tight with emotion. "But I need your help again, Samuel. There's something I've found. Something important." Samuel paused for a moment, sensing the urgency in Victor's tone. "What is it? You know I'm always here for you, Victor. What's going on?" Victor took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I've come across someone who might be connected to Lily. It's a young woman I met at the bank today. Her name's Emily Parker. She's wearing a pendant, the same pendant Lily used to wear. I'm not imagining things, Samuel. I'm sure of it." A long silence hung between them as Samuel processed the information. Victor could hear the faint sounds of a clock ticking in the background, the stillness in the air echoing his own tension. "A pendant, you say?" Samuel's voice was quieter now, thoughtful. "That's a hell of a coincidence, Victor. You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Victor said, his voice firm, almost desperate. "It's the same one. The same design, the same locket. I need you to look into her. I need to know who she is, where she came from, and if there's any connection to Lily." Samuel let out a heavy sigh, and Victor could hear the rustle of papers, the shifting of furniture. Samuel was no longer the young, eager investigator he had once been. His mind was sharper now, honed by years of experience. But his loyalty to Victor had never wavered, and Victor could hear the resolve in his voice as he spoke. "I'll take care of it, Victor. You've always had my word. I'll find out who she is and where she comes from. Don't worry. We'll get to the bottom of this." Victor's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and anticipation. He had spent so many years trying to piece together a puzzle that never seemed to fit. But now, for the first time in a long while, the pieces felt like they were coming together. Emily, the pendant, the unrelenting suspicion that had taken root in his heart. It all pointed towards something he couldn't yet understand, but something that felt closer than ever before. "Thank you, Samuel," Victor said quietly. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." "I know, Victor. I know." Samuel's voice softened. "I'll get started on this right away. I'll let you know what I find." Victor hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, staring at the empty space in front of him. The world outside the windows of his office seemed distant and irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was the road ahead. The answers were within reach. After years of wandering through uncertainty, he might finally be able to uncover the truth about what happened to Lily. As he thought about Emily, he couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just a random encounter, that this was fate, offering him a second chance. Could it really be her? Could this young woman somehow hold the answers to the questions that had haunted him for so long? Victor rose from his desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling estate before him. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the horizon. The light felt symbolic, hope flickering on the edge of a long, dark night. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that would finally bring closure to the pain, the emptiness, and the loss. He glanced down at the pendant in his hand once more. The weight of it felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of the past, of years spent searching for answers, of a promise made to a daughter he hadn't seen in 2 decades. Victor Clarkson was no stranger to disappointment, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that this time, the truth would be uncovered. And if Emily Parker held the key, then he would follow the trail wherever it led. The search for Lily was no longer a solitary journey. With Samuel on the case, Victor felt the weight of the years lift, just a little. There was a path forward now, a path he had long since thought was lost to him, and he was ready to walk it. The morning after his conversation with Samuel, Victor couldn't shake the restlessness that clung to him. His mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, each thought spinning faster than the last. The mere thought that Emily Parker could somehow be linked to Lily made it impossible to focus on anything else. He had lived in a world of uncertainty for 20 years, but now, with Samuel's help, the door to answers was inching open. Victor's pulse quickened with a mixture of hope and fear, the weight of what he might learn pressing heavily on his chest. Meanwhile, Samuel had already set his wheels in motion. After decades of experience, the seasoned investigator wasted no time. He had learned long ago that the truth often lay hidden beneath layers of misinformation, and his instincts told him that Emily's past was one such layer. He knew that to find out if she was connected to Lily, he would have to start digging into her history, everything from her school records to her family background. What he uncovered would either confirm Victor's suspicions or crush them entirely. Samuel sat in his small, cluttered office, the pale light from the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His laptop hummed quietly in the background as he sifted through the sparse details available about Emily Parker. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary enough. A young woman in her mid-20s, working as a bank clerk in a quiet neighborhood. No criminal record, no signs of trouble, just another face in the crowd. But Samuel's gut told him that there was more to her story than met the eye. He started with the basics, her birth records. Emily Parker had been born in the small town of Fairmont, located about 2 hours outside of the city. Her mother, Karen Parker, had been a local school teacher, and her father, an unknown name on the records. According to the documents, Karen had passed away when Emily was just 5 years old, a death that had been officially ruled as a car accident. It was a tragedy, but accidents happened every day, or so it seemed. Samuel's curiosity deepened when he noticed the lack of school records for Emily from the years after her mother's death. It was a red flag. Most children, even those who move frequently, had some documentation from their schooling years, but Emily's records were either missing or curiously incomplete. He scoured through local archives, tracking down any trace of Emily's early years. What he found was a tangled mess of inconsistencies, odd gaps in the timeline, unexplained moves, and a lack of witnesses who remembered her during certain years. It was as if someone had deliberately erased parts of her history. Samuel paused, running his fingers through his graying hair, a frown tugging at his lips. These gaps weren't random. They were intentional, hidden carefully beneath layers of time. Whoever had been watching over Emily had made sure that certain details were locked away, tucked out of sight. It was then that Samuel turned his focus to the woman who had raised Emily after her mother's death, Agnes McBride, a woman in her late 70s who lived in a modest house on the edge of Fairmont. According to the records, Agnes was Emily's maternal grandmother, but there was little else about her. No known family outside of Emily, no significant social connections, and very few interactions with anyone from the community. Samuel had learned that Agnes had been the one to take Emily in after Karen's death, and she had remained her sole guardian ever since. No other relatives were mentioned. Curiosity piqued, Samuel made a call to the small, local police station in Fairmont. He had worked with law enforcement officers from small towns before, and they were often more forthcoming than those in larger cities. After a brief conversation with a sergeant who had worked the case of Karen Parker's death, Samuel learned something that made his stomach tighten. Karen's car accident had been strange, too strange to be a simple case of bad luck. The sergeant mentioned a few details about the wreck that didn't add up, and as Samuel listened, his pulse quickened. Karen's car had been found off the road, the result of what appeared to be a collision with another vehicle. But there had been no other vehicle at the scene, no trace of another driver, no skid marks on the pavement. It was as if someone had intentionally caused her to crash. Samuel made a note to visit Fairmont as soon as possible, but in the meantime, he dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the death. He tracked down the old coroner's report. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, consistent with a car crash. But there was something about the timing that didn't sit right with him. The report mentioned that Karen had been found without a seatbelt, but there were no signs of any struggle or external injuries, suggesting the crash had been anything other than an unfortunate accident. As Samuel pieced together the information, his mind kept circling back to the connection between Karen Parker's death and Lily's disappearance. The similarities were uncanny. Both women had been young mothers, beautiful, vibrant, and both had died under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind young daughters. In Karen's case, the car accident had left her child without a mother, just as Lily had been left without her, and neither tragedy had ever been fully explained. Samuel knew what Victor must be feeling. The hope that the impossible might be true, that Emily could somehow be connected to Lily, was more than just a hope now. It was a possibility. A terrifying possibility that both excited and horrified him. If the threads he was pulling at were indeed connected, if Emily really was tied to Lily, then they were standing on the precipice of something far bigger than a simple case of a missing child. They might be uncovering a tangled web of secrets, of lies, of someone willing to go to extraordinary lengths to erase the past. But before Samuel could act on his findings, he needed one more piece of the puzzle. He needed to meet with Agnes McBride, the grandmother, who might hold the key to Emily's past. Samuel packed his things and booked a flight to Fairmont, determination setting in. He was on the verge of something monumental, and he knew that whatever truths he uncovered in the small town would change everything. Victor's suspicions were growing, and soon, very soon, Samuel would have the answers he needed. Would Emily Parker turn out to be Lily? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the truth, whatever it was finally within reach. The days that followed Samuel's trip to Fairmont were filled with a restless, nagging anticipation that gnawed at Victor's every waking moment. He couldn't shake the sense that he was on the verge of discovering something monumental, something that could either shatter the fragile peace he had built in the years since Lily's disappearance, or finally give him the answers he had been craving for 2 decades. The thought of it made his heart race and his mind spin with possibilities. Was Emily Parker his daughter? The idea seemed impossible, and yet the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place one by one. Victor's phone buzzed one morning, breaking through the thick fog of his thoughts. It was Samuel. "I've spoken to Agnes McBride," Samuel said, his voice tight with urgency. "She confirmed something that makes this whole situation even stranger than we imagined." Victor leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. "What is it? What did she say?" "She told me that the necklace Emily wears, it was passed down from her mother. Her mother, Karen, gave it to her before she died. It's the same necklace that disappeared with Lily." Victor felt his breath catch in his throat. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the walls of his office spinning around him. The very same pendant, the one that had been around Lily's neck the day she vanished. He had never told anyone about it. The pendant, the way it shimmered under the sunlight, the memory of Lily wearing it so proudly. It had been a secret he held close, even as the years wore on. To hear that Emily wore it now, it was almost too much to bear. "Are you sure?" Victor's voice was hoarse, strained with emotion. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the gravity of what this could mean. "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "Agnes said she doesn't know how it ended up in Emily's hands, but it was her mother's, and she's been wearing it for as long as anyone can remember. The timing? It's uncanny." Victor's mind was reeling. The coincidence was too perfect, too specific to ignore. It had to mean something. But what? Could Emily really be Lily? Could she have somehow been hidden away, raised by another family under a different name? "I need to meet her," Victor said, his voice shaking with a mix of determination and fear. "I need to see her, talk to her." Samuel paused, a heavy silence settling between them. "Victor, are you sure? If Emily is Lily, it's going to be a shock to her too. She's spent her whole life believing she's someone else." "I don't care," Victor said, his resolve hardening. "I have to know. I can't live in this limbo any longer. We need answers, Samuel. And if Emily is Lily, I need to bring her home." The conversation ended, but the weight of what had just been decided hung in the air, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Victor spent the next few hours pacing the floor of his mansion, his mind racing through every possible scenario. What would he say to Emily? How would she react to the news? What if she wasn't Lily after all? What if this was all just a series of horrifying coincidences? But deep down, a quiet voice told him that this was no accident. The necklace, the eerie parallels between Karen's death and Lily's disappearance, it all pointed to one thing. Emily Parker might be his daughter. And if she was, there was only one way to know for sure. Victor decided to act swiftly. He called Emily's bank, asking for her schedule, then arranged to meet with her that afternoon. As he stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his suit, he could barely contain the storm of emotions brewing inside him. His heart was in his throat, his thoughts a whirl of what-ifs, and still, he knew he had to go through with it. This could be his last chance to reclaim what he had lost. When he arrived at the bank, Emily was behind the counter, just as she had been that fateful day when Victor first noticed the pendant. She looked up as he approached, her expression polite but guarded. Victor's heart sank as he took in the distance in her eyes, the way she seemed detached, as if nothing could ever truly reach her. "Miss Parker," Victor began, his voice steady but laced with a quiet desperation, "I need to speak with you. About the pendant you wear." Emily's brows furrowed slightly, but she didn't speak, only nodded, gesturing for him to continue. Victor took a deep breath before plunging ahead. "I know it might seem strange, but I need to ask. Where did you get that necklace?" Emily hesitated, the faintest flicker of confusion crossing her face. "My grandmother gave it to me," she said slowly, as though considering whether to say more. "She's had it for as long as I can remember." Victor nodded, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. "Your grandmother? Agnes McBride?" Emily blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, that's right. She's my only family." Victor felt his chest tighten. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. "I'm going to be blunt, Miss Parker," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I believe that necklace belongs to someone very close to me. My daughter. I think you might be her." Emily's face went pale, her expression faltering. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of how to respond. Victor could see the confusion, the fear flickering in her eyes. "I know this must sound insane," Victor continued, his voice softening. "But I lost my daughter 20 years ago, and the pendant you're wearing, it's the same one she wore, the same one she had on the day she disappeared. I need to know if you are my daughter." Emily took a step back, her face a mask of disbelief. I don't understand. What are you saying?" Victor swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. "I need you to take a DNA test. We can have it done quickly, and then we'll know for sure. Please, Emily, if you are my daughter, I need to bring you home." The words hung in the air between them, charged with the weight of years of longing, of a father's desperate search for his lost child. Emily stared at him, her eyes wide, processing everything he had said. I don't know," she said softly, her voice shaky. "I've never thought about my past much. I don't know what this means, but I'll do it." Victor exhaled a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. A flicker of hope ignited within him, though he knew it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the answers he had sought for so long. As he left the bank, the weight of his decision still heavy on his shoulders, Victor felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. It wasn't certain yet, but for the first time in 2 decades, the possibility that his daughter might still be alive seemed real. And as he waited for the results of the test, his mind remained focused on one thought. The truth was closer than ever before. Victor barely slept that night. The hours seemed to stretch on forever, each minute thick with tension as he thought about the meeting with Emily. The DNA test was a crucial step, but there was something else he needed to do first. Something that had been gnawing at him since the first moment he saw Emily at the bank. He had to confront her directly. No more secrets, no more waiting. He needed the truth, whatever it might be. The next morning, after a restless night of pacing the floors of his mansion, Victor put on his coat and made his way back to the bank. He had spent hours the previous evening rehearsing what he would say, trying to predict how Emily would react. But now that the moment had arrived, his thoughts were a whirlwind. What if she denied everything? What if she ran from him? The fear of hearing that his instincts had been wrong weighed heavily on him. But the truth, no matter how painful, was something he needed more than anything else. When he entered the bank, the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet chatter of the tellers did nothing to calm his nerves. His eyes immediately found Emily, standing behind the counter, sorting through paperwork. She looked up as he approached, her face softening into a polite smile, but there was something guarded in her expression, a subtle wariness that made Victor's heart tighten in his chest. She had no idea what he was about to say. "Miss Parker," Victor said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Can we talk for a moment?" Emily glanced around the bank, as though checking for customers or any reason to delay the conversation, but then nodded and motioned for him to follow her to a small, empty corner by the restrooms. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Victor took a deep breath before speaking again. "I've been thinking a lot about this," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "About the necklace you wear, the one your grandmother gave you." Emily's brow furrowed. "What about it?" she asked, her tone more cautious now, as if sensing that something serious was coming. Victor didn't waste time. He looked at her directly, holding her gaze with an intensity that seemed to make the entire room fade away. "It's identical to the one my daughter wore the day she disappeared. The same pendant, the same design." Emily's eyes widened slightly, and Victor could see her retreating inward, like a small animal realizing it's being cornered. She took a step back, her arms folding across her chest. What are you talking about? I don't know anything about your daughter or any pendant she might have worn." Victor's chest tightened. He could see the confusion in Emily's eyes, but there was something else there too. Something that made him feel like she was hiding something. He pressed on, refusing to back down now. "You don't know anything about it? That necklace? It was the only thing my daughter was wearing when she disappeared. 20 years ago, she was 4 years old, and she vanished without a trace. No one ever found her. No one ever knew what happened to her. And now, you're wearing the same necklace?" Emily's face paled, and her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but she fell silent, her hands trembling slightly. Victor's heart beat faster, and the air between them seemed to grow thicker. He could see her struggling to comprehend what he was saying. He didn't know if she understood the gravity of the situation, but he had to make her understand. "Emily, I've been investigating you. I've been looking into your past. Your mother died when you were 5, didn't she? And your grandmother, Agnes, raised you. That's the same age my daughter was when she disappeared." Emily's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I don't know what you're trying to say. My mother died, yes, but that has nothing to do with your daughter, or whatever this is." Victor could hear the strain in her voice. She was defensive, cornered, and confused, but something in her eyes told him she was also scared. She knew something. There was no way this could all be a coincidence. The pieces were fitting together too perfectly, too eerily, for it to just be random chance. "Look, I'm not accusing you of anything," Victor said, softening his tone, though his heart was still hammering in his chest. "I'm just asking questions. Too many things don't add up, and I can't ignore this anymore." Emily took a step back, her face flushed with emotion. She looked at him, eyes wide, as though she were searching for any sign that this was some cruel joke. But Victor's face was a mask of sincerity, of desperate hope. "I don't know what you're talking about," Emily said finally, her voice quieter now, a crack of vulnerability in her words. "My grandmother gave me that necklace. I've always had it, and I don't know who you think I am, but I'm not your daughter." Victor's heart dropped. Her words stung, but he wasn't going to give up now. He wasn't going to let this slip away. "Emily," he said, his voice softer but firm, "I know this is difficult. I know this is a lot to process, but I need to know the truth. Please. The coincidences, the necklace, your background, it's too much to ignore. I don't know what happened to you, but I think you deserve to know the truth about yourself." Emily was shaking her head now, her face a mix of disbelief and fear. She had backed away from him, and Victor could feel the distance between them widening. But he couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. "I know it's hard to believe," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I have to ask you, will you take a DNA test with me? Just to see if we are related. If there's even a chance that you might be my daughter? I need to know." Emily looked at him, her lips trembling as she fought back tears. There was a long pause, a painful silence that stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world had just fallen onto them. "I'll do it," she whispered, barely audible. I don't know what's going on, but I'll do it. For you and for me. Victor exhaled, the tension in his body releasing, but the storm in his heart raged on. They had crossed a line now, and there was no going back. The truth was closer than ever, but what would it reveal? As Victor left the bank, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The moment of truth was finally upon him. The days stretched into an unbearable blur, each one marked by the constant, gnawing weight of uncertainty. Time seemed to move in slow motion, each tick of the clock a reminder that the truth, whatever it was just out of reach. Victor couldn't remember a time when he'd felt this powerless, this vulnerable. He had spent decades searching for answers, only to find himself in a situation where the very truth he sought felt more like a shadow, slipping away just as he thought he could grasp it. Victor's mind was a battleground. His thoughts never stopped swirling, a tempest of hope and dread crashing against each other. Could Emily really be his daughter? Could this young woman, who seemed so different from his memories of Lily, really be the same little girl who had disappeared all those years ago? Or was this just some cruel twist of fate, a painful coincidence that would shatter his last hope for closure? He spent the days in a haze, moving through his routine like a ghost. The business deals, the phone calls, the meetings, all of it felt distant and meaningless compared to the one thing that had consumed him for so long, the search for Lily. The investigation, the questions, the possibility that Emily might be his daughter, all felt like a storm brewing just on the horizon. He couldn't think about anything else. He couldn't focus on anything but that damn DNA test. At night, he would sit alone in his study, staring at the photo of Lily that had been his constant companion for years. Her innocent smile, the way she looked so carefree in that moment, those memories were all he had left. He couldn't let go of them, couldn't bring himself to move on. He never had. Every time he looked at Emily, he saw traces of Lily's face in her features, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her lips, the same way she tilted her head when she was deep in thought. It was as if Lily had never truly left. Victor tried to ignore the aching part of him that feared the worst, the part that feared Emily wasn't his daughter. What if she wasn't? What if the results came back negative, and he was left with nothing but more questions? What if all this time his desperate search had been for nothing? Across town, Emily was wrestling with her own demons. The uncertainty of her origins, the strange connection to Victor's lost daughter, had thrown her world into chaos. Her entire life had been built on the foundation of a story told to her by her grandmother, Agnes. Agnes had always been there for her, raised her with love and care, filling in the gaps where her memories fell short. But now, everything she thought she knew was being called into question. The more Emily thought about it, the more she realized how little she actually knew about her own past. Her memories of her mother, Karen, were hazy. Fragments of a time that seemed like a dream, a faint outline of a life she had lost when she was just 5 years old. She had never questioned the story Agnes had told her, but now that story seemed fragile, broken, like a puzzle missing too many pieces. The necklace, the one Victor had recognized, had always been a comforting link to her mother. It was the only thing she had left from that time. But now it felt like a symbol of everything she didn't know about herself. A connection to a past that felt increasingly foreign. What if the truth was too painful to bear? What if she wasn't who she thought she was? What if she was someone else entirely, someone tied to a man she had never met, a man who had spent years searching for her? Emily couldn't shake the fear that if the DNA test confirmed Victor's suspicions, she would be faced with a reality she wasn't prepared to handle. The idea that her entire life had been built on a lie, that everything she thought was true could be shattered in an instant, was overwhelming. Emily found herself spending long hours in her small apartment, staring out the window at the passing cars, wondering what the future held. Her mind raced with questions. How would Victor react if the test was positive? How would she feel if she was truly his daughter? And if the test was negative, where would she go from there? What would that mean for the life she had built with Agnes? She couldn't help but think about Agnes, who had been the one constant in her life. Agnes had always been her rock, the one person who had loved her unconditionally. But now, even Agnes's explanations felt distant, as though there was something she wasn't saying, something she was holding back. Emily needed to know the truth, but the more she searched for it, the more she realized that her past was a tangled web full of secrets she might not be ready to uncover. Victor and Emily spoke only sparingly in the days leading up to the results. They both knew the weight of what was about to happen, and neither one of them could bear to speak openly about the impending test. Their meetings were brief, filled with a strained politeness, the tension thick in the air. Victor would walk into the bank, his eyes immediately finding Emily's, and they would exchange a few words. Nothing more. The silence between them was almost unbearable, both of them pretending to go about their day as if nothing had changed, as if the test hadn't been taken, as if they weren't both anxiously awaiting the answer that could change everything. The night before the results were to be delivered, Victor sat in his study, trying to push aside the swirling thoughts. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen, scrolling through the endless messages and emails that he had ignored in favor of his search for Emily. He could feel his phone vibrate in his hand, but he didn't even look at it. The only thing that mattered was tomorrow. Victor knew that whatever the results were, they would change everything. If Emily was his daughter, then his search was over, but the road ahead would be filled with new challenges, new questions, new pain, and the monumental task of rebuilding a relationship that had been lost for so long. If the test came back negative, then he would have to face the reality that his daughter was still out there, somewhere, and that the answers he had longed for might never come. As the clock ticked past midnight, Victor finally laid his phone down on the desk. He stared at the photo of Lily once more, the ache in his chest growing. He could feel the tension tightening around his heart, but there was no escaping it. Tomorrow, he would know the truth. The morning arrived with an oppressive stillness. Victor awoke to the quiet hum of his home, the soft chirping of birds outside his window barely breaking the silence. It was the calm before the storm that was bound to shake the very foundation of his world. He sat up in bed, staring at the digital clock glowing on the bedside table. It was 7 a.m. The results would be coming soon. His fingers hovered over his phone, which had been silent for the past few days. He could feel the weight of it in his hand, the anxious anticipation that had been building over the past week. Victor had spent a restless night, tossing and turning, unable to escape the thoughts swirling in his mind. What if the test came back negative? What if the life he had built, the facade he had lived with for so long, collapsed in an instant? But there was another part of him, the part that refused to let go of hope, the part that still believed, against all odds, that Emily could be his daughter. The sound of his phone buzzing against the wooden table broke the silence, and Victor's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed it in an instant, feeling a surge of both dread and hope. The screen lit up with a message from Samuel Reed. "The results are in. Meet me at the office." Victor didn't hesitate. He stood up, his legs weak beneath him, his mind racing as he quickly dressed and made his way out the door. The drive to Samuel's office was a blur, the world outside moving at an unnatural speed, while inside, time seemed to crawl at a snail's pace. The road stretched before him like a dark, uncharted path, and every passing moment only deepened his sense of urgency. When he finally reached Samuel's office, his pulse was pounding in his ears. He walked into the lobby and found Samuel already waiting for him, standing by the door to his private office, a folder clutched tightly in his hands. Samuel's face was unreadable, his expression neutral, but Victor could see the tension in his posture, the same tension that had gripped him for days. "Victor," Samuel said quietly, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something that felt almost foreboding. "I have the results." Victor nodded, his breath shallow as he tried to steady himself. Samuel gestured for him to follow into the office, where a large desk sat against the far wall, papers and files scattered haphazardly across its surface. It was in the midst of this disarray that the truth would finally be revealed. "Here it is," Samuel said, sliding the folder across the desk. "You should read it yourself." Victor reached out, hands trembling as he took the folder. His eyes scanned the document quickly, heart racing as he processed the words. Then, finally, it hit him. The DNA test confirms that Emily Parker is the biological daughter of Victor Clarkson. The words were clear, precise, and undeniable. Victor felt his legs give way, the room spinning as he gripped the edge of the desk for support. The shock was overwhelming. He had spent so long hoping, yearning, but now that it was real, now that the impossible had come to pass, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Emily, she's my daughter, he whispered to himself, barely able to grasp the enormity of it. Samuel stood there, watching him with a quiet understanding. I know this is a lot to take in, he said gently. But now you know. You found her. Victor could barely respond, his mind spinning as he clutched the folder to his chest. He had found her, the daughter he had thought he had lost forever. The little girl who had disappeared without a trace was standing before him, working as a bank clerk under the name Emily Parker. It seemed impossible, too surreal to be true, and yet here it was, undeniable. Without another word, Victor rushed out of the office, barely acknowledging Samuel's parting words. He didn't have time to process any more details. He had to see her. He had to hold her, to tell her, to make sure that this wasn't some cruel dream. The drive to the bank felt like an eternity. The same roads, the same familiar streets, but everything had changed. It was as if the very air around him had shifted, filled with the weight of a truth that was only now beginning to sink in. When he arrived at the bank, he didn't pause to think. He walked straight to the counter where Emily was working, her back turned as she helped another customer. She didn't notice him at first, but then she turned around, and their eyes met across the room. Victor froze. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic words. He simply stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at her, unable to move. The reality of it hit him in waves, crashing against him with an intensity he wasn't prepared for. She was here, standing before him, so close, and yet so far away. The girl he had lost was no longer lost. She was here, in the flesh, but everything else felt uncertain. Could she really be the same little girl he had loved? Emily looked at him, confusion and surprise clouding her features. For a moment, neither of them moved, unsure of what to do next. Emily, Victor said, his voice thick with emotion, I know who you are. The words hung in the air between them, and she blinked, as though trying to make sense of them. What do you mean? She asked, her voice small, vulnerable. Victor stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and the words came out in a rush. I'm your father. I'm Victor Clarkson. You're my daughter, Lily. Your real name is Lily Clarkson. Emily's eyes widened, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then to something else. A flicker of recognition, a realization that seemed to dawn on her like a slow, reluctant wave. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She just stared at him, her face pale, her lips trembling. Victor reached out, hesitantly, his hand shaking as he placed it gently on her arm. I know this is a lot to take in, he whispered, but it's true. The DNA test, it confirms it. You are my daughter. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her eyes searching his face as if looking for some sign, some reassurance that what he was saying wasn't just a cruel joke. She looked down at the pendant around her neck, the one she had worn for so long, the one her grandmother had given her. It felt heavier now, its meaning shifting in an instant. Then, without a word, she stepped forward, her arms trembling as she wrapped them around him. Victor hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was real, unsure if this was how it was supposed to be. But then he held her close, pulling her into his arms, feeling the weight of all the lost years, the years of searching, of longing, of hoping that this moment would come. They stood there, embracing in the middle of the bank, both of them unsure of how to move forward, of how to process the overwhelming truth. But in that moment, for the first time in 2 decades, Victor felt the crushing weight of the past begin to lift. His daughter, the girl he had lost, was back, and though the road ahead would be long and filled with questions, they had found each other again. The rest, they would figure out together. Victor had barely slept since the revelation. His mind was still reeling, processing the unexpected reunion with Emily, the daughter he thought he had lost forever. He was consumed by questions about the years lost, about the mystery of her abduction, and about the man who had orchestrated the pain and confusion that had torn his life apart. It was a cold, gray morning when Victor's phone buzzed, the persistent ring pulling him from his restless thoughts. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, but instinct told him that this was no ordinary call. He answered quickly. Victor, Samuel's voice crackled through the line, urgent and steady. You need to sit down. I've uncovered something. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He had grown accustomed to Samuel's calm tone, but the way he spoke now, with the hint of a storm in his words, sent a shiver down his spine. What is it? Victor's voice was taut with anticipation. It's about Emily, Samuel continued. The truth behind her abduction. It's not what you think. The man who took her, his name is Graham, and he's someone from your past. Someone you know. Victor's stomach twisted. He leaned against the wall, his hands gripping the phone tightly, bracing himself. Who is this man? What does he want with Emily? Samuel took a deep breath before continuing. Graham was a former business associate of yours. A deal went south a few years before Lily's disappearance. You didn't know it at the time, but Graham was deeply offended by how things turned out. He had a vendetta, and your success had become the target of his anger. But he didn't just want to destroy you professionally. He wanted to make sure you paid for what he saw as your betrayal. And he knew the most painful way to do that. Victor felt his chest tighten as the pieces began to fall into place. He kidnapped Lily. He took her to hurt me. Yes, Samuel confirmed. He arranged for Emily to be raised by the Parkers, a family he knew would keep her out of sight. He never let her get close to anything that might reveal the truth. All the while, he stayed in the shadows, watching your life unravel from afar. Victor's mind raced. His thoughts were tangled, spinning with memories of the failed business deal, the sharp words exchanged in heated meetings, and the bitter fallout that followed. But he had never imagined that something so personal could arise from it, a vendetta so intense that it could lead to the abduction of his own daughter. The bitterness in his chest grew heavier, and he felt an overwhelming wave of anger surge through him. Where is he now? I want to speak to him. Samuel hesitated for a moment. I've found him. He's staying in a house just outside the city. But Victor, you need to be careful. Graham's motives are driven by years of resentment. He's not the same man you once knew. Victor's pulse quickened. He had waited 20 years for answers, for some explanation that could make sense of the nightmare his life had become. Now that he was so close to uncovering the full truth, there was no turning back. He had to confront this man. He had to know why Graham had done this, why he had taken Emily from him and sentenced both of them to a life of misery. Thank you, Samuel, Victor said, his voice cold and firm. I'll take care of it from here. The drive to Graham's house was a blur. The street seemed to stretch out before him like a dark tunnel, and Victor's hands gripped the steering wheel with a force that made his knuckles turn white. The world outside the car window seemed distant, like a dream, unreal and fleeting, while the storm inside his mind raged with questions, emotions, and the need for answers. He arrived at the house after what felt like an eternity. The building stood at the end of a long, winding road, isolated from the rest of the world. Its windows were dark, the shadows inside casting an eerie silence over the property. The once grand estate now felt cold and abandoned, a reflection of the bitterness that had driven Graham's actions. Victor stepped out of the car, his every movement deliberate, his mind sharp with purpose. He knew what he had to do. He had to face this man, the man who had stolen his daughter, and make him answer for the years of pain and torment. The front door creaked open as Victor approached, and a figure stepped into view. Graham. Victor's breath caught in his throat. The man before him was older than he remembered, his features more weathered, but the hatred in his eyes hadn't changed. It was the same cold, calculating look that had once been present in every business deal, every confrontation. But now, it was darker, more personal. You, Victor spat, his voice thick with contempt. You're the one who took her. Graham didn't flinch. He stood there, arms crossed, looking almost disinterested. I don't know what you're talking about, he said flatly, though there was a flicker of something deeper in his gaze. A recognition, a resignation. Victor's fists clenched at his sides. Don't play games with me. I know everything. You kidnapped my daughter. You made sure she grew up not knowing who she really was. And for what? Because of a failed business deal? Graham's lips curled into a bitter smile. You don't understand, Victor. I had to make you pay. You had everything, and you took it all from me. My reputation, my career, all of it crumbled because of you. I wasn't going to let you walk away without facing the consequences. Victor's blood boiled as he stepped forward, his voice rising. So, you took my daughter to punish me? You ruined both our lives. And for what? A petty vendetta? I lost everything. My family, my peace of mind. And for what? You think that's going to make things right? Graham's face tightened, his mask slipping for just a moment. It's not about making things right. It's about making you suffer. And I did. You have no idea what it's been like, watching you live your perfect life while mine fell apart. This was the only way to make you understand. Victor's mind raced with a mixture of disbelief and anger. This was the man who had taken everything from him, who had stolen his daughter to get back at him for something that, in hindsight, seemed so insignificant. A deal, a failed business deal. And yet it had set into motion a chain of events that had ruined so many lives. I never wanted to hurt you, Victor said through gritted teeth. But this was unforgivable. Graham's eyes flickered with something close to regret, but it was gone before Victor could fully register it. Maybe, but I did what I had to do. The silence between them was thick, a heavy weight that hung in the air. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice quieter now. You've had your revenge, but you've ruined your own life in the process. You've taken my daughter, my family, but I'm done with this. I'm done with you. With that, Victor turned and walked away, leaving Graham standing on the doorstep of his crumbling house. He had gotten his answers. The truth was finally out. And while it didn't bring back the years that had been stolen from him, it gave him something far more valuable: closure. Victor knew the road ahead would be long. The damage had been done. But now, with Emily, Lily by his side, he would rebuild. He would fight for the family he had nearly lost, no matter what it took. And Graham, wherever he went from here, would be a footnote in the past, a chapter that had finally come to a close. Victor's final words echoed in his mind as he drove away. I'm done with you, but I'm not done with my daughter. The days that followed the confrontation with Graham were heavy with silence, but also with a sense of purpose. Victor and Emily found themselves in a delicate, fragile space, both physically and emotionally. The bond they shared, forged through a turbulent, painful past, was still new. Each conversation felt like an attempt to stitch together a patchwork of memories and emotions, each layer weighted with the years they had lost. Victor was determined, almost obsessively so, to rebuild what had been broken. He spent every waking moment trying to create a sense of normalcy. He took Emily on long walks around the estate, showing her the gardens, the rolling hills, and the quiet pond that had always been his refuge. It was his way of offering her a new beginning, even though he knew the pain of the past would be impossible to erase. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when Emily would withdraw, her mind clearly elsewhere, her eyes clouded with confusion. She would stare out at the vast estate, lost in thought, trying to make sense of everything. The years she'd spent growing up with the Parkers, the love and the stability they had offered her, felt like a distant life now, one that she didn't fully understand. And the truth of her abduction, the reason behind it, the weight of the emotional trauma she had endured, all of it loomed over her. Victor could see the struggle in her eyes, the way she searched for answers, even as she felt torn between the two worlds that now defined her existence. He wanted to reach her, to help her make sense of it all. But one evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and bathed the estate in golden hues, Victor found Emily sitting on the veranda, staring out at the horizon. He approached her slowly, quietly, and sat down beside her. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds, were the only sounds that filled the space between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was so much to say, so much still left unsaid, but the weight of the moment held them both in silence. Finally, it was Emily who broke it. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. Victor, I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I thought I knew, it feels like it's slipping away. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face for some answer, some reassurance that everything would be okay. Victor's heart ached for her. He could feel the rawness in her words, the vulnerability that she was struggling to express. He reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. I know, he said quietly. I know this is all so overwhelming, but we'll figure this out, Emily. Together. Her eyes searched his for a moment, as if looking for something, an anchor, maybe, in the storm of her emotions. She looked down at the pendant around her neck, the one that had once belonged to him, the one that had connected her to the past in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. It was still so much of a mystery to her, just as the truth of her own past. "I want to understand," she said after a long pause. "I need to know everything. About my mother, about why this happened, about the years I missed. I don't want to live in the dark anymore." Victor nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I'll help you find those answers, Emily. Whatever it takes. I promise." But even as he spoke, he knew that some answers would be harder to come by than others. Some pieces of the past would forever remain elusive, slipping through his fingers like sand. But he also knew that the most important thing now was to be there for her, to give her the time and space to heal. The years they had lost could never be fully reclaimed, but they had an opportunity to build something new, a future, a relationship, if they were willing to face the past together. And so they did. Slowly, gently, with patience and love, they began to rebuild. Victor made it a point to spend more time with Emily, getting to know the woman she had become during their years apart. He listened to her stories, small, insignificant moments from her life with the Parkers, the family that had raised her with love and care. He asked about her favorite books, her childhood dreams, her hopes for the future. He wanted to understand her, not just as the daughter he had lost, but as the person she had become in the absence of him. For Emily, it was a slow and cautious process. She found herself opening up, little by little, to the man who had once been her father. There were moments of joy, moments when she laughed with him, when they shared memories together. But there were also moments of pain, moments when the enormity of her past overwhelmed her. She would retreat into herself at times, struggling to reconcile the two versions of her life, the one she had known with the Parkers and the one that had been stolen from her. But through it all, they moved forward, together. Weeks passed, and the estate began to feel like a home again, not just for Victor, but for Emily too. She began to let go of the fear and uncertainty that had weighed on her for so long. She started to embrace her new reality, one where she was no longer a girl lost in the world, but a woman finding her place in it. And Victor, for the first time in years, felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. His life had been consumed by the search for Lily, but now with Emily, he could look ahead to the future. One evening, they stood together on the edge of the estate, watching the last of the sun dip below the horizon. It was a quiet moment, one that felt full of promise. The night was settling in, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky above them. "I know we still have a long way to go," Victor said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had been through. "But I'm hopeful for us." Emily smiled, a small, wistful smile, but one filled with a quiet strength. "Me too," she said, her voice steady. "We have each other now." And in that moment, standing together in the fading light of day, they both knew that while the past could never be undone, they still had a future they could shape, hand in hand, as father and daughter. The road ahead might be difficult, but they were no longer walking it alone. As they turned back toward the house, Victor wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. Together, they would rebuild, not just the family they had lost, but the bond that had always existed between them, waiting to be rediscovered. The journey was far from over, but with each step, they moved closer to the peace and healing they had longed for. And for the first time in years, Victor could finally see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. The story of their reunion was still being written, but it was no longer a story of loss. It was a story of rediscovery, of healing, and of the quiet power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And as they walked forward into the future, they knew that whatever it held, they would face it together. As Victor and Emily stepped into the house together, there was no longer any distance between them, no barrier of time or the weight of memories lost. Though their past still lingered, heavy and painful, what mattered now was that they had found each other and were starting over from scratch. They were no longer alone on this journey, and that was all they truly needed. Victor looked into Emily's eyes, seeing a new light, a hope he had long since lost. Though the road ahead would still be long and difficult, they would face it together. From the fragments of the past, they would build a new family, stronger and more complete than before. "We've found each other, Emily," Victor whispered, his voice full of emotion. "And no matter what, we will never let each other go again." Emily smiled, a genuine smile, no longer clouded by confusion or the pain of the past. She nodded, gently taking Victor's hand, her eyes shining with the peace she had sought for so many years. "Yes, we'll move forward together. No more getting lost." And as night fell, with the stars twinkling above, they sat side by side, savoring the serenity of the moment. It was a sign of a new beginning, a new chapter in their story, where there was no fear, only love, forgiveness, and hope. They knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but no matter what, they had found each other, and that was the most wonderful thing in the world. The story doesn't end here. It is merely the start of a long journey filled with promise. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this entire story and watch the video. Your support means the world to me, and I truly appreciate every moment you spent with us. If you enjoyed the story and found it engaging, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your likes and subscriptions help us continue creating content that you love. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And stay tuned for more exciting stories coming your way. Thanks again, and see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Please note, this video was generated using AI technology to read the story. While we strive for accuracy and clarity, there may be some occasional errors or mispronunciations. We kindly ask for your understanding and patience if any mistakes occur. If you notice any issues or areas for improvement, please feel free to leave a comment below. Your feedback is invaluable and will help us enhance the quality of our future videos. We appreciate your support and engagement. Thank you for being part of our community. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and we'll see you in the next video.